We are very pleased and happy to be able to bring to you our main speaker. Our keynote, this is really our keynote speaker, we're calling that, and it's Dr. James Waller, who is here. He is the Cohen Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College in New Hampshire. I might say Keene is the only college in the country with an undergraduate degree in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. So any of your students who maybe want to follow that may consider applying to Keene. It's a great place. He's a professor at the in that program. He is the author of a number of books, but the book I wanted to mention because it's based. His speech will be based on that. It's a really great book. It's called "Becoming Evil: How Ordinary People Commit Genocide." And his talk, as I said, will be based on that book, and I would recommend it to everybody. It's he also is known actually all over the world. He's been a researcher on genocide and also an advocate for the victims of genocide, which sadly continue, and you'll hear about proliferate, and also someone who's worked for world peace, which is obviously very challenging. So we're very happy to have Dr. Waller here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Can you hear me okay? I'm back. Thank you to Ron. Thank you for the Holocaust Genocide Studies Center. Thank you, President Douglas, for the invitation here. It's a beautiful campus. Wonderful to be with you. I'll try to make sure you guys feel somewhat included as well as we go on. I want to say a special thank you to Honorado, who amazingly pulled all this off in just hardly any time at all. So please join me in thanking him for pulling this together. As Ron mentioned, I'm the Cohen Professor at Keene State College. It's exactly 2 hours, 21 minutes from here by car. So anyone who is interested in additional work in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, as Ron said, we're the only school in the country to offer a major in that field, and would love to have you look at us if you want to continue your education. What we want to talk about today is a very difficult topic related to perpetrators. Not victims, not bystanders, not survivors, not architects of genocide, not the bureaucrats who carry out genocidal policy, but the actual rank and file. The people who pull the triggers, the people who swing the machete, the people who do the hard work of killing in the face of genocide and massive violence. This is a field I've worked in now for close to 25 years. When I first started working in the field, I'd say it was safe to say that we knew far more about the broad mechanics of mass murder than we did about the men and the women who actually carried the murder out. So we were very fascinated with the bureaucracy and structures and the architects. And you could read a book on the Holocaust, and at the end of it, if I asked you the question, who committed the atrocities, all you could list to me were some architects and bureaucrats, most of whom never killed anyone face to face, although they made the policy. But you would have known next to nothing about the individual people who actually carried out the killing. So over the course of my time in this field, in addition to far more archival work than anyone should ever have to do, I've had the chance to also travel the world and interview alleged and convicted perpetrators of atrocity face to face. To this point, I've interviewed about 225 perpetrators of atrocity in countries as far-ranging as Guatemala, Colombia, Chile, Peru, the former Yugoslavia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Croatia, Montenegro, the Great Lakes region of Africa, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and most recently during my time as a visiting professor at Queen's University in Belfast in Northern Ireland. In those interviews, I'm sitting with perpetrators who, some are in prison, some have been in prison and now they're released from prison, some will never see a day of prison. And my question as a social psychologist is not a question of who, what, when, and where. That's been laid out by the courts. That's been laid out by historians. My question is a why question, a how question. How do these people come to commit these atrocities? How do they justify it in their minds? What are the reasons they use to make their perpetration okay? in their minds. When I do those interviews and that field work, I also, when I'm on the ground, take the opportunity to speak with victims and survivors. Some call themselves victims, some survivors, some victim survivors, and also bystanders, witnesses, because I want to ask them, as these tragedies were unfolding, how did you think these people were justifying why they did what they did? Many times these people were your neighbors. How do you understand people who you've known for 30, 40, 50 years who started committing these atrocities? So I'll start today with an example from one of those interviews I did with a survivor of the Rwandan Genocide. I'll apologize in advance. It's a graphic example, but this is a graphic topic. This was a young woman who had survived the genocide in 1994. Whenever I interview survivors in these cases, it is up to them how long we speak, what we speak about, where we speak. And the mutual friend who had introduced us said that she wanted to go back to the site of the massacre that she survived for the first time, and she wanted to tell her story. The Rwandan Genocide, as many of you know, happened in 1994. It was 100 days. In that 100-day period, 800,000 Tutsi and moderate Hutu were killed by Hutu extremists. We don't have any segment in modern history, any 100-day segment of any genocide, where 800,000 people were killed. Not by highly sophisticated technical means, but mostly by machete, mostly by masu, clubs with nails driven through them. 800,000 people in 100 days. Most of those killings, the large-scale killings, took place in churches and mission compounds, like the church you see here, a Catholic church in a small village called Intarama. The reason that these were the places of killings actually goes back to 1959, 1962, the first time Hutu extremists targeted Tutsi for destruction. About 2,000 to 3,000 were killed over that 3-year period, but most survived because they fled to churches. They fled to missionary compounds, and the killers would not cross those boundaries to kill. So on April 6, 1994, when the killing starts again, Tutsi husbands and wives say to their loved ones, get to the churches. If you get to the church, you're going to be safe. The killers won't come into the church. But in 1994, Hutu extremists had a different version of a final solution in mind. So with all the Tutsi fleeing to these churches and mission compounds, what had they done to themselves? They had rounded themselves up for slaughter, unknowingly. The killers came, they threw grenades at the church, the windows and the doors. They came in, they raped some, they killed everyone. So many of these sites of massacre today are sites of memory in Rwanda. Here at this church in Intarama, 5,000 people died. Very small church, much smaller in square footage than what we're setting here. 5,000 people died. She wanted to go back to this church to tell her story because she was one of the few survivors of the massacre. We walked up to the church with our friend. Today, this is a place of memory. That's why you see the metal shed over this. We walked to the front door of the church. She couldn't enter the front door because of the trauma she had suffered 4 years earlier. So this is in 1998. She could not enter the front door, but I could look into it, and I'd actually been to this church before. And the first time I visited Rwanda, you'd look into these churches and these mission compounds, and the victims just lay where they had fallen. You didn't have to look hard to see the defensive wounds on the forearms of victims who tried to shield themselves from machete. You didn't have to look hard to see the skulls that were cleaved in two or some with bullet holes. Over time, Rwanda has kept rethinking how they keep these places of memory, but still today at this church in Intarama, the bones and remains of many of the victims are in there. They're stacked neatly, but this is Rwanda's sense of memory. She began to tell me her story at the front door of this church. She said she fled here. She found her way to the back of the church by a window. Killers came in. They raped. They killed. They came to kill her. And the day she was telling me this story, it was a hot day in July in Rwanda. She had a scarf on. She took the scarf off. She had a wound that ran from the front of the neck to the back of the neck, a machete wound. No idea how anyone with a wound like that could survive it, but she did. As the killing went on in Intirama, and this was about a 14-hour spree of killing, she was cut, she was left for dead. The killers thought they had killed her. They went to other parts in the compound to kill other people, and eventually she's able to gain enough strength, despite this wound, to crawl out of a window and crawl to another outbuilding behind the church. This small building was a Sunday school classroom. And she was able to find her way on her hands and knees, she told me, behind this building, and I stood with her behind the building, and she said, "Here, I lost consciousness. I'd lapse into and out of consciousness for about 6 to 8 hours, but every time she woke up, she said from inside this small building, she heard the same sound. And she just said it was a slap. And a few seconds would pass, and she'd hear another slap. A few seconds would pass, and she'd hear another one, and she said it just sounded like a wet slap. She knew it wasn't the sound of machete hitting bone because she had experienced that. She had heard that. She knew it wasn't gunfire because she heard some gunfire at the massacre as well. Eventually, the killers left Intirama. She has regained enough strength to find her way to look inside this small room that she had hidden behind. And what she saw is very different than what we see here. What she saw was about close to 200 children thrown across these concrete pews. The children had been killed. She had been listening to the killing. How had the children been killed? They've been swung headfirst against the wall. So the stain you see there is a blood stain. That blood stain's not preserved. It's not archived. That blood is in that brick. So deep in that brick, it'll be there as long as the brick is there. That's what she had heard. Now, for all of its brutality, and again, I apologize for the graphic, real brutality of it. For all of its brutality, it's not anything new in genocide studies. U.S. cavalry troops had killed Native American children in the 1800s by swinging them headfirst against trees. In Cambodia, if you ask to see a memory place in Cambodia, you'll often be taken to a killing tree where children and young adults were picked up, swung headfirst against trees. In the Holocaust, Ukrainian paramilitaries killed Jewish children by throwing them, slinging them headfirst against carts. In Armenia, Turkish paramilitaries killed children the same way, slinging them headfirst against buildings. So, for all its brutality, unfortunately, it's not something unheard of, certainly not something unseen before in genocide studies. So our question comes here, how would we describe, if we have to step away from the experience of the victims, how would we describe the people who carry out something like this? The men, and in this case, it was all men, who were in this room doing this killing. What are the first types of words that come to mind? Just throw things up. Monsters. Sadist. Insane. Evil. Beasts. Demonic. Psychotic. In many ways, I start with this example because 4 years later, I was back in Rwanda in prison, Central Prison 23 in Kigali. I mean, I wasn't there as an inmate. I was back there interviewing people in the prison. I always need to make that clear. I'm interviewing people in the prison, and a prisoner comes out, and he either came out early or I got his folder late. And typically the folder just tells me who, what, when, where. It's the charge sheet, what he's been charged for and convicted for and sentenced for. I didn't get a chance to see it. We started the conversation cold, and 2 or 3 minutes into it, he said something that triggered a memory, and a few minutes later, I realized exactly what it was, that he had been in this place. Just by coincidence, I happened to be interviewing him. He not only had been one of these killers, but he had been the person organizing the killing in this Sunday school classroom in Intirama. Now, we could be done now if I could say to you he was demonic, he was sadistic, he was insane, he was a madman, he was a lunatic, he was a beast. All those descriptors, we could have it done. But who was he? He was from this village in Intirama. This is his home. This is a small village, 300-400 people. This is his home. This was his church. He had been an altar boy in this Catholic church. The week before the killing, he had received Mass in this church before the killing started. By occupation, in his village, he was the equivalent of a 4th, 5th, 6th grade teacher. We asked him, were any of the children you killed in this room your students? He said, yes. He was a well-known footballer in the region. He was actually the soccer coach for the village. Were any of the children you killed your athletes? He said, yes. When we went back to the village, we talked to people, Tutsi, who knew him, and said, he was a great father, he was a great son, he was a great husband, he was a great member of this community. We trusted our children with him. We would have never expected he could have done anything like this. When we asked him the questions of, how did you come to do this in Intarama, to people you knew, to community you grew up in, all he could keep repeating in Kinyarwanda, all he could keep repeating was, I lost myself. I did not know who I was. I lost myself. I did not know who I was. So you see the challenge of working in this field. And again, I know it's when you come to Holocaust and genocide studies, your focus and your lens are on victims and survivors, as they should be. And we spend a lot of time and study there. But there's never been any such thing as a perpetratorless genocide. For every victim, there's always been what? A killer. There's always been a killer. And we cannot let those people remain in the shadows simply because we don't want to talk about them. Simply because it's too painful to ask the questions they raise. So what I want to do with you over our time together is think together about the questions raised by these people and the lessons. I have 5 lessons hidden throughout this presentation like little Easter eggs. They're not actually hidden. If you don't see them, it's just because you're asleep. But look for the 5 lessons as we go through that I think will be important for us. One issue has to do with the question of numbers. How many people does it take to carry out this type of atrocity? We don't actually, no one can give you precise numbers here. Because when the killing is over, who does justice go after? Leadership. We go after the big fish. We go after the big architects typically. Rank and file, it's hard for justice to get its hands on. One of the phrases I use often is genocide overwhelms justice. In other words, genocide is such a tidal event in society that when it's over, one of the many hard questions society has to ask itself is, can we afford to do justice? Do we have the time? Do we have the people? Do we have the resources? Let's go back to Rwanda. When the killing is over, July 4th, 1994, there are 7 judges and lawyers left alive in Rwanda. We can't do justice there. The infrastructure's been destroyed. That's very typical after cases of genocide. So all we can do are offer estimates. We can estimate in the Holocaust, 100,000 to 500,000 killers. I certainly think it's much higher toward the upper end. 500,000 people who perpetrated atrocities face to face. At the end of the war, the end of World War II, there were surviving still over 800,000 former SS members at the end of the war. Of that number, we've successfully prosecuted 124. The reality of justice after genocide is, if you're a rank and file killer, you're very, very likely to get away with it. You'll go back to doing whatever you did before the conflict started. For many of them, that means going back to be police, going back to be military, going back to be political leaders. We simply do not have the resources and a lot of times not the political will to bring the rank and file to justice. In Rwanda, sorry, I'm sure I just did that. In Rwanda, the questions are 75,000 to 250,000. I mean, Rwanda is a country the size of Vermont, much more populous, obviously, but a country geographically the size of Vermont. 800,000 people killed. Again, I think the number's up at the upper end. At least 250,000 people who bloodied their hands with the hard work of killing. In the former Yugoslavia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, 15,000 to 25,000 people. Judges tell me, Bosniak, Muslim, Croat, and Serb, who committed crimes during the war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of genocide, that are never going to be brought to justice, but should be brought to justice. So even though we can't give exact numbers, we can say it takes thousands of people at the front lines for genocide to be successful from the mindset of the perpetrator. So here's lesson 1 of 5, a critical mass. You do not have to commit large-scale violence, you do not have to persuade everyone in a society to commit violence. You just have to persuade a critical mass of people that it's necessary, or in many cases, that it's permissible. And again, when I talk to perpetrators around the world, that's one of the things they keep coming back to is, we were told it was okay to do this. There was no law against it. We were encouraged by our politicians to do it. They transferred, and this is important for us today to think about. Perpetrators admit they transferred their conscience to someone else. They let someone else be their conscience, and whatever that someone else said was okay to do, they did because they transferred their conscience that way. We can't give away our individual conscience to political leaders, social leaders, religious leaders in that sense, because many times it leads down to this path and road. My central research question has been for these 25 years, who are these people who perpetrate these type of atrocities? Can we recapture the experiential history of these killers, the choices they faced, the emotions they felt, the coping mechanisms they employed, the changes they underwent? In other words, can we step into the shoes of the people who carried out these atrocities, not to forgive, not to exonerate, not to apologize, but simply to try to understand how they came to do what they did? Because if we understand it, what hope does it give us? I heard murmurs, but somewhere in there, I'm going to say, someone said, we can stop it. If we understand it, we can start to understand how we build the structures and solutions to make it less likely for people to commit these type of crimes. Now, the danger here is that by stepping into the shoes of perpetrators, you certainly run the risk of excusing their behavior, apologizing for their behavior, and that's not something we have any intent to do. Understanding and forgiving, apologizing, those are completely separate enterprises. We're trying to understand the behavior so it is not repeated, so we can stop it in the future. So that's what we're looking at. I think, when I think of this quote here, I think, for instance, of the time I spend at Auschwitz. I also work with a group called the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation. We train government officials, military and police on issues of genocide prevention. Over the 11 years I've been with the group, we've trained now over 4,000 government security sector personnel from more than 85 countries around the world. Most of those trainings take place in Poland at Auschwitz, the largest of the 6 Nazi death camps. On day 2 of the training, they visit Birkenau, which is the actual killing center at Auschwitz. They walk into it, and they're looking at what they should look at. They're looking at the enormity of 430 acres of a killing center that the Nazis meant to exist forever. It was a permanent killing facility. After the Jews, there would have been another group. There would have been another group and another group until the Nazis got the racial ideology satisfied that they wanted. I find myself, because it's been probably 45 times now I've been to Auschwitz with these groups, I find myself looking the other way, and I'm looking across the street at a row of houses. Some of those houses are post-World War II. Some of those houses were there during World War II. But I know from historians at the museum that there were a row of houses there that housed Nazi personnel. Some of the houses were dormitory-style housing for the single officers who were appointed to Auschwitz. Some of the houses were family housing. And a Nazi personnel appointed to Birkenau decided to bring his family to Birkenau for that appointment. What were their jobs at Birkenau? The job was killing. It was the only reason the camp existed. It wasn't a concentration camp at Birkenau. It wasn't a labor camp. It was a death camp. Auschwitz had other camps, forms of camps, but Birkenau's job was to produce death. If you're a Nazi and you worked there, that was your work. You got up in the morning, you left your home, you crossed the street, and you did your work, which was to kill, to produce death in large numbers. At the end of the day, you came home, you crossed the street. I wasn't there. I can assume you came home to a home-cooked meal. If you had children, I can assume you read bedtime stories, tucked your children in. You had a wife, I can assume they had relations with their wives at different times. The next morning, you wake up, have breakfast, cross the street, and you go back to your work. And your work is the job of killing. How do people cope with that life? How do people cope with those choices? What emotions do they feel? What type of changes do they undergo? So that's what I've spent my focus and work on. Other people have, excuse me, asked the same question, but have focused on something very different. Other people have said, when you think about extraordinary evil, like the example we started with, it has to have extraordinary origins. And if I were to say to you, if there's just one part of this you stay awake for, y'all doing actually great at staying awake. This is very different than my classes. So if there's one part here, it is that I know the cognitive tendency is you see extraordinary evil and you assume an extraordinary cause. What I'm asking you to do in this time we have together is think about extraordinary evil, but think about the very ordinary causes. Sever that relationship and say, the causes of this type of evil don't have to be extraordinary. They actually can be very ordinary in the sense of the types of things you and I experience on a daily basis. Some people have disagreed and said, no, it's just a collective. Groups of people come together, bad things happen. That's true. Sometimes groups of people come together, bad things happen. But sometimes groups of people come together and incredibly good things happen as well. What groups do is they do what this microphone does to my voice. They amplify the tendencies of people within them. If you bring together a group of bitter, angry, resentful people, yeah, being together as a group, you've been in those groups. You know that it just gets ratcheted up. You bring together a group of good, kind, caring, cooperative people, you know that in those groups you start to ratchet those feelings up as well. So I want to be careful about how we think about issues of group. I want to be careful about how we think about issues of ideology, what you believe. I think a lot of people tend to assume that perpetrators have some hateful ideology, some belief system, and that's what drives their behavior. It happens sometimes, but in my experience over the years, sitting face to face with over 200 of these, this is very seldom. I mean, if they have hate-filled worldviews, they tend to have developed after the killing as what? Justification, a reason for it. And I've seen this time after time after time again. It's one Hutu perpetrator I sat with, and one of the questions we ask is, when did you start having these feelings about Tutsi? When did you think they should be exterminated, when they were bad for your community, and so on? And he honestly said, and this is very typical, he said, oh, I've always gotten along with Tutsi. I have members of my family who married Tutsi. I would have married a Tutsi woman if the possibility had arisen. Tutsi had been fine. But when I started killing them, that's when I learned to hate them. That's not hatred driving killing. That's hatred being used to justify killing done for other reasons. Greed, opportunism, careerism. So I want to be careful about ideology. And then finally, before you came in today, if you had asked a friend, who are the type of people who perpetrate this type of evil, most of them would have probably said something along the lines of, these people have to be crazy. Now, crazy is not a technical term. I just used it like it was. I'm a social psychologist. I'm not a clinical psychologist, so I have permission to use crazy. I don't have to go for the technical terms. Technical terms are pathological. It's been sociopath, psychopath. It goes back and forth in history. But the assumption is the only type of people who could commit these atrocities have to be crazy. They have to be pathological. They have to be people we can identify at a distance as not being mentally healthy. So at Nuremberg trials after the Holocaust in 45, 46, we actually have a psychiatrist and psychologist who do some testing on the defendants at Nuremberg to try and address this question. And one of the tests they give them is the IQ test. The IQ test has been normed from its beginning and still today across cultures. So if the average score on the IQ test is what? 100. Good. Who said that? Good. Very brave. That's a hard question. If you answer that question wrong, that doesn't look good on you when you can't get the average IQ. But you jumped up, you said it. It's 100. You go to college, graduate, average IQ is 110. PhDs, average IQ is 120. I'm a PhD. I work with PhDs every day. We're 80, 85 on our best days is what we're reaching for. What did we, for comfort reason, and again, what we want to do with perpetrators is we want to keep them out there, away from us. What are we hoping their intelligence is? Low. We're hoping it's low because if they're stupid, and again, that's not our technical term, but if they're stupid, we can fix stupid. I've always thought, I'll never be a college president like President Douglas. If I am, the motto of the school is going to be, we fix stupid. That's what we do. That's what we're here for. So if they're stupid, if they're low intelligence, we can fix that. What do the results say? Bright people, all above 100, 110, 120, couple of the defendants, 130, 140. These were very, very intelligent men on trial at Nuremberg. So if it's not intelligence, then certainly it has to be pathology. This is our go-to test of pathology. This is a Rorschach ink blot. This is called a projective test. It's so vague and ambiguous that you're supposed to project your personality into it without really knowing it. I'm not trained in Rorschach analysis, so please don't start blurting things out. I'll say that because it was it 4 months ago? I was in Romania. We were doing a training for the Romanian National Police Academy. Very hierarchical structure. It was first-year cadets, but the head of the academy was in the room. So they're all deferring to whatever he says, and this slide came up, and I didn't ask for anything. I didn't say anything. I was just going on my merry way, and then he started just blurting out everything he saw in this Rorschach. And I had to interrupt him and say, I don't know how to interpret this, but I just hope, I'm glad he didn't go dark places. He was seeing rabbits and butterflies. If he'd seen knives and guillotines, I'd been worried, but everyone just kind of let him go because he was a police chief. So don't say what you see. I can't interpret it anyway. But what we're looking for, what are we hoping for? Again, to keep these people at a distance, we want them to be what? Sociopaths, dark. We want them to be crazy. We want them to be pathological. What did the results reveal? Mentally healthy people. One psychiatrist who reviewed the results said these defendants tested as mentally, psychologically healthy and normal, much more healthy and normal than I feel after I read the results, because we thought they'd be crazy. The only one who tested pathological was a man by the name of Julius Streicher. And some of you know Streicher. He was the editor of Der Stürmer. So all the anti-Semitic images you see from the Holocaust, they came from the very twisted mind of Julius Streicher. But here's what you need to know about Streicher is before the trial started, his co-defendants, other Nazis, said to their legal counsel, don't put us on, we know we're going to be on trial, but we don't want to be tried with Streicher because he makes us look bad. When a Nazi says about you that you make them look bad, you're pretty bad. So even his co-defendants knew Streicher was crazy. So what it leaves us with is, well, if it's not pathology, it's not intelligence, maybe it's some twisted Nazi personality. Again, we haven't found this. People look for decades for the so-called Nazi personality. We don't have it. There's no personality test I can give you to determine who's more or less likely to perpetrate these type of atrocities. So it leads us to lesson 2, which is really the central lesson of my time with you, which is it's ordinary people like you and me who commit genocide and mass killing. W.H. Auden once wrote, evil is unspectacular, but it's always human. He wasn't saying the effects of evil are unspectacular. The example we started with, that's spectacular evil. But Auden was saying the people who commit it are unspectacular and always human. One of the questions I often get, I was actually in Atlanta last Thursday and Friday. We were doing a training for U.S. law enforcement personnel from around the country. And we did a version of this, and one of them asked in the questions, what does it feel like when you sit with evil? And I understand the intent of the question, but honestly, I can't answer it. 225 interviews, 3, maybe 4 people I've sat with that I thought, there's no point of connection here. And that's not why I'm there. But I felt like that must be what this guy is asking about, because that felt like sitting with evil. The other 221, absolutely, people like you, people like me, people I work with, have gone to school with. I mean, striking just in their ordinariness. What makes this argument so difficult for us to admit, to understand, to absorb? Why is this such a painful thing for us to look at and say, yeah, I think that's true?
Because it could be us. That your neighbor could do this.
I'm sorry?
You want to believe that someone you know could do something like that.
Good. I think there are 2 levels of understanding. She's hit one. One is you don't want to believe other people in this room could do anything like that. And that's a very uncomfortable world to live in, to look around you and go, God, other people in here could do something like this. That's, you know, it makes me feel a bit uneasy. But someone else mentioned really the deeper lesson is not only what it says about others, but what it says about us. What does it say about my capacity to do something like this as well? And again, I'm simply talking here about capacities. I'm not saying most people will do this, because in truth, the vast, vast majority of us never do anything like this. But do we all have the capacity to do something like this? I would argue that we do, that it's ordinary people like you and I who carry this out. When I was in Northern Ireland, just quickly, this was a Tuesday night, I spoke to a group of former IRA people. They were all still in the IRA, but I have to call them former when I speak publicly. Former IRA men, some version of this lecture, because this is what I do. And afterwards, they came up and they just flooded me. They're like, "Oh, Dr. Wally, that's brilliant. That's the best lecture we've ever heard. We finally understand those murderous Protestants on the other side of the road." And then, this is no lie, the next night, I was with a group of former loyalist paramilitary, same lecture, same reaction. We finally understand those murderous Fenian bastards over there, those Catholics. And it was good, because I thought, you got half of it, but there's another half, which is, what does it say about our capacities as well? Tina Rosenberg has written about violent criminals in Latin America, and she said this, I wanted them to be monsters. And when you came today, you probably would feel a lot better if what we talked about here were just pathological monsters. But as she says, coming to understand this is not the case was disturbing, for what it taught me about these people and ultimately about myself. I did not want to think that many of the violent are people like us, so civilized, so educated, so cultured, and because of that, so terrifying. And I think that is the terrifying piece, that perpetrators are civilized, they're educated, they're cultured, they're like us in so many ways, and that's the most terrifying reality of it. So I've spent the majority of my career trying to understand what are those tiny things that help us understand how people come to do this. Because I've never interviewed a perpetrator, and I do think they're being honest with this, who said, you know, for all my life, I waited to kill Tutsi, Jews, Muslims, Christian, whomever. It's always been some variant of, I never thought I would do anything like this. I never thought I'd be capable of doing anything like this, but I did one thing, and that led to another thing, and it led to another thing, and they had these series of escalating commitments that at some point, they were doing something they never in their life envisioned they would do. Again, it does not excuse them, because at every step in that process, they made a what? They made a choice that someone else didn't make. And I'll get this in Rwanda. Actually, the perpetrator we talked about at the beginning, from Ntarama, he kept saying to me, you have to understand, we didn't have a choice. All the pressures in the village. And I said to him, Jean Paul, because I knew his village well, you have 2 brothers. They didn't do this. They grew up in the same village. One of them lived in the same house with you. They were subjected to the same things. They didn't kill. Now, they didn't rescue. They were bystanders, but they didn't kill. They didn't do what you did. They didn't hack to death and kill. Over 30 people is what he was convicted for. So the choices that perpetrators make, they still have to be held accountable for. So the three things I've looked at just quickly are these. One, I wanted to look at the cultures people come from. Cultures differ in how they think about groups as related to identity. Cultures differ in authority orientation, social dominance. Some cultures just work more easily within authoritarian structures. That doesn't make those bad cultural characteristics, but it does mean when an architect of genocide comes to power, he or she in a culture like that is going to have a bit easier time recruiting the people to kill because they already work within those authoritarian structures. Now that said, this is the third lesson. While these cultural constructions are always important for us to understand, each of us still have capacity and agency. Now today, I'm talking about the capacity and agency to commit every crime. But we also each have the capacity and agency to commit every good. So I certainly don't want you leaving here thinking all of us are predisposed toward this evil and this is what we naturally do. It's not what we naturally do. Again, most of the people in the world never do anything like this. It's simply a capacity issue. We have the capacity to commit these types of crimes, but we also have the capacity for incredible good. And I'm sure that those of you who study courses here in the Holocaust and programs at the Holocaust and Genocide Center, you occasionally see those glimpses of the capacities that each of us have for that type of good. I've also focused quite a bit on how perpetrators see the other. How do they come to think of the other person as not just someone it's okay to kill, but actually someone, if they don't kill, they're committing a sin. Do you see the difference there? So an archival testimony from a Holocaust perpetrator I read one time where the prosecutor said to him on trial, "How did you come to think it was right to kill Jews?" And he said exactly that. He said, "It's not that I thought it was right to kill them. I thought it was wrong if I didn't kill them." In other words, they posed such a threat to me and my group that they had to be eliminated. And that word threat is a word that we see consistently. If you were to ask me what one thing have I seen in nearly every interview with a perpetrator, it's been some expression of the word or sense of threat. That they killed the other because the other posed a threat. Does the threat have to be real? Not at all. It just has to be a perceived threat. Threat doesn't have to be real, it just has to be perceived. So we see perpetrators who easily engage in us-them thinking. We see perpetrators who do not turn off their morality. I'll get this question a lot. How do perpetrators lose their compass or turn off their morality like a light switch? I don't think that's the case at all. Perpetrators absolutely see themselves as fundamentally moral people. Nearly everyone I've talked to has upheld his or her morality. How can they say they're moral people when they're killing dozens of people? They say it because what they've done with their morality is just reoriented it this way. And they can say, I'm a fundamentally moral person because I behave in moral ways with these people. Now, these people, I don't behave in moral ways, but that doesn't change the fact that I'm a moral person because these people aren't deserving of my moral commitment. And if we're honest, we all make some of those type of judgments in our daily lives. We decide who's worthy of moral consideration in our communities, who's less worthy or who's not worthy. And then finally, there is very much the reality of blaming the victims. Perpetrators have, I'm convinced, perpetrators cannot physically live for long periods of time having to face the reality of what they've done. So what they do is they build cognitive structures, emotional structures that protect them, that fence them in, that keep them away from facing the reality of what they've done. And one of those big tools is blaming the victims. Because when they can blame the victims for their own victimization, they're not responsible. We see this all the time in our culture with victims of what? Rape and sexual assault. And at some point, someone close to those victims very often will ask questions like what? What were you wearing? What did you say? How much did you have to drink? Why were you there that time of night? Why did you go to that place and not this place? We ask those questions, and they're re-victimizing questions. We ask them because we want to somehow believe we live in a safe world and that people who are victimized by these types of things did something to bring it about. I'll give you 2 examples from my research. There was only one Holocaust perpetrator I ever interviewed face-to-face. It was 1990. I was teaching in Berlin. He was a well-known perpetrator. For a fee, he would be interviewed. We had a 45-minute interview. 44 minutes were great. He said all the right things. Horrible what we did to the Jews. Stain on our national conscience. Should never have done it. And he had been convicted of these crimes. Terrible things we did. On and on and on. But I still remember going to close up the recorder, and he was sitting in the back of his chair. And as I went to close it, he moved up in his chair and he pointed his finger in my face. And he said, "But you have to remember, the Jews were going to take over the world." And then he sat back, and I thought, that's what I needed from this whole interview, was I was just trying to figure out how you've lived with yourself. And he told me. He still thought, 45 years later, what he did was right, because if he didn't do it, the Jews were going to take over the world. Now, a second example that shows us blaming the victim, doesn't have to have any basis at all in reality, and not that the first one did. Serb perpetrators in the former Yugoslavia. I was with my translator a few years ago, and we were interviewing a group of 6 who had committed crimes but had never been convicted. They were all still police officers. And they wanted to be interviewed in a bar. So we went to the bar. We'd pull one in the back at a time to ask our interview questions. And one of the questions is, why the Bosniaks? Why the Muslims, Bosnian Muslims? Why did you target them? And the first person we asked that to said very quickly, because the Muslims killed Christ. And I let it go. I mean, I thought, it's fine. Second one comes in, why the Muslims? Because they killed Christ. I mean, there's no hesitation. And my translator, who was Croatian, is getting really bothered by this, because why? What's wrong with it? Yeah, we got 2 problems. One problem is we've already committed the historical crime of pinning the crucifixion of Christ on Jews, even though it's completely inaccurate. So there's a line here of people who killed Christ that you have to get into. But the bigger one is Muslim faith doesn't exist for 700 years. I mean, it's not like it's off by 2 days. It's 700 years. So my translator, and I'm going to admit here, I fully admit to you, just between you and I'd lost complete control of the situation. And the translator was pulling up Wikipedia in Bosnian language, and he was starting to show the people. He said, no, look, it's here. It's 700 years later. They couldn't have killed Christ. And generally what they responded to us with was, no. Don't confuse me. Our priest told us, they're Orthodox priests, they killed Christ. And the priest blessed them in this particular group. The Orthodox priest had blessed them the night before the killing and had joined them on the killing the next day. And the priest said to them, doing it because they killed Christ. So they all kept saying, no, our priest told us this, it's true. And one of them finally, our translator, got through to him somehow, and he said, okay, maybe it's true, what Wikipedia says, that the Muslims didn't exist at the time. But if they had, I'm sure they would have killed Christ. And at that point, you throw your hands up and you say, blaming the victim is such a strong cognitive mechanism for us. It doesn't have to be true. You can make up whatever you want to because it just serves the purpose. And then the final piece, so the 4th lesson then, is this danger of othering. That one of the things we recognize is that in societies with deep divisions, where people have been othered in some way, when democracy fades, when the rule of law retreats, you're always going to find people who can perpetrate these atrocities against whoever has been defined as other. It's why for us, we have to be intentional. And I've always seen community colleges as democracy's colleges. You are the front line of holding all of us accountable to recognize that if we let democracy go astray, if we don't hold firm to democratic institutions and all the things that go into it, the people who we've identified as other in our nation, and we have them, and we have them, there will be people absolutely willing to step up and perpetrate atrocities. Every country in the world is at risk of genocide. No country's immune. We're no better than other countries in thinking we're immune. In many ways, I wrote a piece a couple years ago and I said, if you look at what's unfolding in the US, if we saw this type of behavior politically and socially in an African country, a Latin American country, an Eastern European country, everyone would be looking at it saying, wow, that country's going down the slopes. That country's in trouble. We got to keep an eye on it. No reason that we're immune to that at all. I mean, we're a country founded on the twin evils of the extermination of one people, native people, and the enslavement of another people, Africans we brought here. The thought that somehow we're so exceptional, we can never return to those type of atrocities, is the height of arrogance to think that. So we're always on defense of our democratic principles. And then finally, I do focus a lot on the group dynamics of the groups who do the killing. Genocide doesn't happen because one person goes off on a killing spree. It happens because people get together in groups and they decide to kill other people in large numbers and over an extended period of time. So I'm interested in those group dynamics, the peer pressure, the conformity, the pressures of socialization, the binding factors of the group, because these groups come to have deep meaning to the people who are in them. I've interviewed in Rwanda several killers who were members of groups called the Interahamwe, these paramilitary groups, some of them as young as 12 years of age, who bonded together, many of them coming from homes without fathers involved, some of them coming from homes without fathers or mothers, small villages. These killing groups became their families. That's what they bonded over. Now, it's great that they had these groups to identify with. The problem was, the group they identified with, their task was killing. So you interview them in prison 20 years later, and they can't wait to get back out and rejoin these groups. Not to kill, but because the groups had become so important to them just in a sense of family, a sense of fraternal bonding in many ways. So I'm interested in the social structures that surround these groups. And this is our fifth lesson, that we should be less concerned about bad apples, the individual people. We have to be more concerned about the barrel, the structure, the system that they're coming into. Again, I'll go back to last week in Atlanta with the law enforcement personnel. We talk with them about identity-based violence as the purpose of the seminar. And they'll often keep retreating back to, and they're good people, they often keep retreating back to, yeah, we got to keep the bad apples out. You know, we get some cops that are bad apples. They shoot when they shouldn't shoot. They're too aggressive. They're too violent. We got to protect ourselves from the bad apples. And I spent 2 days just keep pushing back, saying, yeah, you got to protect yourself from bad apples, but what is the barrel? What's the structure? What's the situation people come into? If the structure of a police force is a toxic masculinity, you're going to make bad apples, regardless of who you get in there. If the structure is militaristic, if the structure is hierarchical and authority-driven, that structure is what we have to pay attention to. So these really are the 5 things that, if you've been asleep, now you can wake up, you get these 5. The critical mass, the dead end of demonization, our human capacities and agency, the danger of othering people, and the power of social structures. All of these, if you are interested more in these, as Ron said, this is the subject of Becoming Evil, the book I wrote in 2002 and 2007. I don't know which slide people want to see, so I'm going to leave it here. But I want to finish. You've been great about staying with us. I want to take just a few minutes of questions, comments people might have, and then we'll wrap up. Things people want to ask, or yes, please.
So we're talking a lot about men. What about women?
Good. So if you didn't hear the question was, we're talking a lot about men. What about women? This is a great question, because in genocide studies with perpetrators, we do tend to see far fewer females carrying out these crimes than we see males. So then the question becomes, do we see fewer females because they don't have the capacity or they don't have the opportunity? So many times people will take a very gender-biased position and say, well, females don't do this because there's something about the feminine nature and spirit that makes them more nurturing and they could never carry out these atrocities. I'm on the other side, which says, no, females don't do this as often. They do it. They don't do it as often because they don't have the same opportunities. The genocide often happens in very male-dominated societies, paternalistic structures, and females' responsibilities tend to be more, like in Rwanda, it wasn't killing as much as it was stripping the bodies of the clothes, washing the clothes, selling them at market. But when given the opportunity to kill, women clearly show they have the same capacity. None of this should be a surprise to us, because after the Holocaust, survivors of camps would often write about female concentration camps, and they'd write about the guards of those camps and say, these guards were more brutal than the male guards on the other side of the camps in many cases. So I do think females have the capacity to commit these atrocities. They simply aren't in genocidal societies often given the opportunity. That said, the very first conviction of genocide for Rwanda, the first conviction was a woman who was the Minister of Education and Family Affairs in Rwanda, but had actively participated in killing. Other questions? That was a good one. Yes?
You talked about being in Poland and doing genocide prevention training.
Uh-huh.
How do you approach that? I mean, I realize some of this is what you're talking about, but how do you tell a culture, okay, you're going down that road, don't do it?
Oh, that's a good question. It's not that we're telling Poland that, but what we do in Poland is we hold week-long seminars at Auschwitz with the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, and the seminars are for government and security sector people from around the world. So we're drawing Latin America, Africa, Europe, US, Canada, everyone's coming to these seminars. We do it in groups of 24. And the seminar week is really three things. We're working with them because they're frontline people. So we want to teach them what genocide is, what the warning signs are, and most importantly, what they can do in their jobs to make a difference, because their jobs carry more leverage than most of the jobs we have. This was a brainchild of a Jewish philanthropist from New York City a dozen years ago who has recently passed away, and Fred's point was to say, academics always talk to other academics about these issues. None of you can do anything about it in a large sense. Why aren't you talking to government leaders? Why aren't you talking to military and police personnel? And those are the over 4,000 people we've had a chance to speak with over the course of the years at the Institute. Yeah. Yes, please.
How do you get the right people to come to these?
How do we?
Are they self-chosen?
Question was, how do we get the right people to come to these seminars? They're not self-chosen. We identify certain offices within governments, and it's typically human rights offices, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or some form of their Department of Justice. And what we're looking for is we don't want to train a person. We want to train someone who goes back to their home country and says, the whole of government needs to take this approach to prevention. So I'm terribly proud of the work we've done, because we have 6 countries in Africa that now have what the US doesn't have, an Office of Genocide Awareness and Prevention. We have 12 countries in Latin America that have those offices, and we've trained and established all those offices. We've trained the people in those. So to some degree, it is targeted attendance for these and targeted recruitment. Sometimes the government comes to us and just wants to send a diplomat for whatever reason, but yeah, usually now at this point we've been able to target that. Questions? Ooh, one in back. This is the steepest room I've ever taught in. I gotta tell you, I'm gonna get vertigo up here with the, yeah.
When speaking with perpetrators, do you ever ask them their opinion on other genocides to see if that can smell pain, what they've done to them?
Wow, that's a great question. No, yeah, I'm sorry. The question was, in interviewing perpetrators, do I ever ask them about other genocides to kind of get a sense of context? It's a great question. I have not asked that. It relatively seldom comes up. The truth is, in many cases, you know, I'm sorry to keep going back to Rwanda, but it's where I've been most recently. But one of the first times I went to Rwanda, I was talking with some survivors of the genocide. So this was probably 3 years after the killings. And they were talking about the trauma they were experiencing, but they didn't have the language. They were describing it. And I said, you know, people who went through the Holocaust have a lot of similar reactions to having survived the Holocaust. And it was a group of 3 or 4 women, and it just fell dead. And finally, one of them said, what do you mean Holocaust? And I realized they had no idea what the Holocaust was. And then when I explained this to them, I still remember one of them stopping me. She put her hand on my knee, and she stopped me, and she said, you mean other people have been through what we've been through? And in some ways, it was both assuring for her, and it was also both terrifying for her. You mean someone else has had to go through what we've been through. So I think in a lot of these cultures and contexts, there's probably relatively little awareness historically of other cases. Certainly in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the World War II is definitely on their mind, more painting them as victims rather than anything else. But no, we haven't asked that question, and I'm glad you raised it though. It's a good possibility. Someone else. Yes, we'll go here and then here and then here. Triangle.
Yeah, what you were saying about like people transferring their moral compass to someone else is pretty fascinating. Like how much have you guys done with like evolutionary psychology and seeing how people evolve in groups? I don't know what the accepted thing is.
Yeah.
How much that affects that mentality of.
It's a great question. When I first started writing Becoming Evil in 2002, I had a friend say to me as I was going through drafts, I really had to get into EP. I didn't know what EP was. It was evolutionary psychology, but it was just starting as a field. So there's actually a significant part of one of the chapters in the book that deals with evolutionary psychology and its implications for understanding this, because as you point out, the reality is that we have a long evolutionary history where things like us-them thinking have worked well for us. Yeah, where things like moral reorientation have worked well for us. So another thing I want to point out is that I don't approach this at all as a blank slate problem. We have natural ingrained tendencies within us that we have to work within those frameworks and understand how those frameworks constrain some of what we do in terms of prevention. Thank you. Good question. Yes?
I'm curious, your reactions to like after World War II, the prosecution of the war crimes both in Germany and in Japan were pretty minimal compared to the numbers like you described. And we actually, though, we brought a lot of them over. I mean, we actually brought them into this country to reintegrate them. What was there a rationale to that? Or?
No, I think the rationale was twofold. He was asking about perpetrators, why not the pursuit of justice after World War II. The rationale was twofold. The ones we brought over tended to be scientists. We were working on both atomic weapons, nuclear energy. There were many German scientists who were members of the Nazi Party that the U.S. could see benefit in, and those were brought over. Space, rocket technology. You could argue that we got to the moon as quickly as we did because we had Nazi scientists that were brought over by the U.S. after World War II that did a large part of that engineering work. So some of it had those purposes. I think others of it, as I said earlier, a post-genocidal society does have to ask itself the question, how many people can we afford to prosecute? How many people can we afford to put away? West Germany wanted to move on fairly quickly. East Germany actually did a fair amount of prosecution. Now, it wasn't always fair prosecution, but they brought a good number of people to justice. But really, the question becomes, to what degree can society sustain those pursuits of justice? And again, if you forgive me, I'll just go back to Rwanda. Rwanda had put 400,000 people in jail, most of them just awaiting trial. One of the first interviews I did in Rwanda, when I get the file folder, it tells me the expected trial date. And I called the guard back and I said, something's wrong with the date. And he said, no, it's right. The expected trial date was almost 100 years to the day from where I was sitting with this guy. The system just can't keep up with it. And in Rwanda, their economy started to suffer because they had so many people in jail that the farms were laying fallow. And the government had to make a tough decision and say, if we want to get this economy back, we're going to have to bring workers back into the economy. And that was a large part of the reason for the amnesty program. So you know, genocide pushes our thinking about justice in some different ways because it involves so many thousands and thousands of people. Yes, sir, here and then over here.
Why do you think religion is such a motivation for collective action for genocide as opposed to other motivations of human existence?
Can you repeat it again, I'm sorry?
Why do you think religion is such a
Oh, religion.
motivation for collective action for genocide as opposed to other reasons? for
Good.
genocide? I mean, you don't see the genocide
Yeah.
over property lines to the same extent. I mean, historically, we have
Yeah.
laws, we have this, we have that.
Yeah, the question is, if you didn't hear it, why religion plays such a big role. There are a lot of things we go to conflict over. We do go to conflict over property and territory and resources, but genocide, I've always argued, at its heart, is an identity-based conflict. That genocide is about, you have an identity that we no longer wish to exist. Native Americans, how did we respond to them when we came here? It was, you have an identity we don't want to exist. If you lose that identity and become like us, dress like us, worship like us, speak like us, you can live with us. But at some point, even that wasn't successful because they're still Indian at the end of the day. Religion is that most common form of identity that we see in identity-based violence. Why? For me, when we look at the things that identity-based violence leads to, this us-them thinking and so on, when you add to it the weight of a God that says, where you can say, it's not just me who says you're wrong, but it's a God, it's a religious authority, it's an institution, a church that says you're wrong, I think that weight really does impel some of these forms of destruction. Sometimes it's religious identity tied to other identities. Like Bosnia-Herzegovina, it's really an ethno-religious identity. Muslims were Bosnians, Catholics were Croats, Orthodox were Serbs. So sometimes it's religion tied in with other stuff, but religion has always been, unfortunately, a great divider among people, and unfortunately is something often used to justify violence. Someone had a question.
It is 1:45,
Okay.
so students need to leave to go to their classes.
So I'm going to take that part so we're not distracted by people leaving, but thank you very much for staying with it. I appreciate you being here. Thank you.